The Somnoscope Project. Dr. Eris Thorne was a man who believed in facts, not frights. He was a neuroscientist whose career had been dedicated to a singular goal: the demystification of sleep paralysis. While millions across the globe recounted chilling tales of night hags and shadow people sitting on their chests, Thorne saw only neurological artifacts. He argued it was a natural, albeit terrifying, byproduct of the brain's handling of the liminal state between sleep and wakefulness. In fact, he felt a certain disdain for those who attributed these phenomena to supernatural forces, dismissing them as mere cultural folklore. His passion for the subject had deeply personal roots. Years ago, his younger sister Lily suffered from a severe form of sleep paralysis. She described terrifying visions figures that stood by her bed, and a weight she insisted was cold and malevolent. She eventually died in her sleep from a cardiac arrest, and though doctors attributed it to a rare genetic anomaly, Thorne was convinced the psychological toll of these hallucinations had played a part. He believed that if he could have scientifically explained to her that it was merely a product of her own mind, perhaps she would have survived. This knowledge became his obsession. Thorne had spent the last 5 years working on what he called the Somnoscope Project, a cutting-edge device designed for high-resolution, real-time brain activity mapping. His goal was to capture and visualize the very neural impulses that created these shadow people. He was certain he could show how the brain, starved of sensory input from the body, filled the gaps with fabricated, frightening imagery born from unconscious fears. This machine, he believed, was the final nail in the coffin of the supernatural. His first test subject was a young woman named Maya, who had suffered from sleep paralysis since childhood. Her accounts were classic: tall figures with long fingers and whispers that spoke a language that didn't exist. Thorne approached her words with detached professionalism, noting them in his journal only as further confirmation of his hypothesis. He fitted her head with a mesh of electrodes and connected her to the somnoscope. As Maya drifted to sleep, Thorne watched the flickering display, which presented a complex, galaxy-like map of her brain activity. 3 hours in, her scream shattered the silence. It was soundless, a choked gasp, and Thorne knew she was in paralysis. On the somnoscope screen, exactly as he predicted, there was a sharp spike in amygdala activity, the brain's fear center, coupled with the suppression of neurons responsible for movement. But then came the anomaly. A strange, pulsating energy signature, a vague outline of a human figure, appeared on the display. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Thorne dismissed it as interference. He reassured Maya, but she was terrified. She stammered about seeing the shadow, adding a chilling detail. "It was pointing right at you, Dr. Thorne. It knew you were watching." Thorne chuckled nervously, attributing it to fear transference. But the strange flicker on his monitor bothered him. His scientific logic would not allow him to accept it. It was simply a data anomaly. To prove himself right, he decided to do what none of his colleagues would dare: hook himself up to the apparatus. Thorne believed his trained scientific mind would not succumb to fear. He was confident that if he experienced sleep paralysis, his consciousness would not be weak enough to conjure an entity. The distorted reflection. That night, for the first time in his life, Thorne experienced sleep paralysis. His body became like concrete, and an unbearable weight pressed down on his chest. The terror he had seen in his patient's eyes was now his reality. He tried to move, but his brain seemed utterly disconnected from his body. Then he saw her. It wasn't a shadow figure. It was his sister Lily, but her face was distorted, like a glitch in a cheap video game, and her eyes were empty and black like voids. "Help me, Eris," she whispered, but her voice was like the static of a malfunctioning speaker. The words were garbled, as if the data itself was corrupted. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His heart hammered in his chest, and his brain screamed, "This is impossible! It's just a hallucination! It's the brain creating images to fill sensory gaps!" But he couldn't convince himself. It was too real. When he finally snapped out of it, Remembering how he had forced himself to blink until the terror receded, he immediately checked the somnoscope data. The image recorded from his brain was virtually identical to what he had seen when Maya's paralysis hit, an anomalous spike in activity, and that ghostly energy signature pulsating just as it had before. This was impossible. His brain, rational and scientific, could not create such a thing. It wasn't just a hallucination. He went through his records, his past studies, and everywhere patients described figures, these same anomalies were present. They weren't random. They were imprints of what they had seen. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but these figures were somehow leaving a trace in the brain. But why? And why were they starting to manifest in his home? He was a skeptic, after all. He began to dread going to sleep. He knew they would return. He no longer drank coffee. His mind was in a constant state of hypervigilance. He read books on quantum physics, on string theory, trying to find some explanation that could fit within a scientific paradigm. He knew they weren't products of his imagination. He had seen them in his equipment. They were real. The next night, the paralysis came swiftly. He hadn't even realized he'd fallen asleep. This time, he didn't see Lily. He saw something far more terrifying. A figure, tall and hunched, stood at the foot of his bed. Its arms were long and thin, and its fingers were like spider legs. It reached out to him. "Eris, you cannot escape," it whispered, and its voice was like the rustling of dry leaves. Thorn tried to scream, but he couldn't. He tried to move, but he was completely immobilized. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just seeing it. He was feeling it. He could feel its presence in the room, its malevolence, and its coldness. The final experiment. With each passing night, the terror intensified. The entities became more personal, more horrifying. One night, he saw the small creature with a face like a twisted doll. It sat on his chest, its red eyes glowing with malice. It whispered things into his ear that he had buried deep within his subconscious, about how he had once lied to his sister, about refusing to help her when she asked, about not visiting her grave. These entities, it seemed, were living embodiments of his guilt. They were not just hallucinations, they were reflections of his soul. They were not from without, but from within. They were his own demons. He had reached his breaking point. His scientific career, his belief in rationalism, everything he had dedicated his life to was crumbling before his eyes. He could no longer distinguish between dream and reality. His paralysis began to occur not just at night, but during the day, as he sat at his desk. He felt his body grow heavy, his mind plunging into nightmare. He saw them in the mirror, reflections that vanished when he blinked. He couldn't comprehend how his brain, which should have been his greatest ally, had become his deadliest enemy. In his final desperate attempt, Thorn made his most desperate decision. He hooked himself up to the somnoscope one last time, but this time, he aimed the cameras directly into the room. If these were hallucinations, he wanted to document them. He wanted to see his mind create these images. He wanted to film them, show them, explain them. He lay in bed, connected himself to the equipment, and closed his eyes. He immediately plunged into paralysis. His body was completely immobile. He felt the cold that cut through the blankets. He felt someone standing by his bed. He opened his eyes. The entity was there. It was the Shadow Man, but this time it was solid, tangible, almost real. It leaned over him, its long fingers touching his chest. Thorn felt its icy touch. He tried to scream, but he couldn't. He tried to blink, but he couldn't. He was utterly helpless. In that moment, his eyes fell upon the somnoscope screen. Thorn expected to see an empty room. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the screen, in the exact spot where the entity stood, a white pulsating energy field appeared. It was not a hallucination. It was a pure, energetic presence, registered by scientific equipment. His machine, his scientific pride, was designed to prove that the supernatural did not exist. Instead, it had proven the opposite. The entity standing over him leaned even closer. "We are here, Eris," it whispered. "We are here because we are you." It touched his forehead, and Thorne felt his mind and body completely shut down. The line between dream and wakefulness blurred completely. He was not just paralyzed, he was trapped, a prisoner in his own mind, which had conjured living demons from his guilt and fear. Now he knew that his scientific beliefs were wrong, and that the entities he saw were not merely products of his imagination, but something that had emerged from the darkness of his soul. And now they were with him, in his room, in his consciousness, and he couldn't move. The end.